Clara Whitmore's hands were shaking so badly she could barely feel her fingers when the auctioneer seized her arm and dragged her forward. The wooden platform groaned under her weight as she stumbled, 7 months pregnant, her faded blue dress streaked with dust and humiliation. The late spring sun burned down on Briar Hollow, 1873, as if even heaven refused to look away from the spectacle. Her 10-year-old son, Caleb, stood stiff beside her, jaw clenched so tight it trembled. Little Rose, barely 8, buried her face in Clara's skirt, her thin shoulders quivering. Laughter rolled through the crowd like a filthy wave. "Well now," the auctioneer boomed, tipping his hat back. "What am I bid for this fine widow and her litter? Comes with another on the way." The men laughed louder. One even slapped his knee, throwing his head back in cruel delight. "Ha ha ha," he barked as if this were a circus. Clara felt something inside her splinter, not break, splinter, because breaking would mean there was nothing left, and she still had something left, dignity. Barely, she lifted her chin. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks, but her voice was steady when she whispered, "Lord, let my children survive this." Caleb tugged at her hand. "Mama, they're not really selling us, are they?" She bent slowly, pressing her forehead to his. "Listen to me, no matter what happens, you're not property. You are my son, you hear me?" His eyes glistened, but he nodded. "Brave boy, too brave for 10. Before we go further into Clara's story, if you're listening right now, wherever you are in this wide world, tell me your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. And if stories about courage and second chances move you, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts below. What happens next will test your heart and maybe restore it. Now, that terrible morning had begun in the county poorhouse. 20 women and children crammed into a space meant for half that number. The air smelled of mildew, sweat, and quiet despair. Clara had woken on the hard wooden floor, her back aching, her unborn baby pressing against her ribs as if protesting the world it was about to enter. Up, the matron snapped at dawn. Auction day, auction day. Clara had once lived in a neat cabin with white curtains and a husband who whistled while chopping wood. Then the fever came, took Henry in 6 days. Took their savings in burial fees. Took their roof when she couldn't pay the rent. Debt redemption, they called it, a tidy phrase for selling human lives. As they were herded through town, respectable citizens stared. Some looked away. Some didn't bother. A woman spat near Clara's feet. Caleb straightened his shoulders. Rose clung tighter. The auction block stood in the center of town, the same platform where horses were sold. First came young widows without children. $12, 15, 23 for a pretty one. Then Clara Whitmore, the auctioneer shouted, widowed 2 young uns and a bonus inside her. The crowd howled. "What am I bid? $5. Silence, her heart sank. "Not even worth 5, 2, someone called mockingly. Another voice chimed in, 250, but I only want the boy. "No," Clara cried before she could stop herself. "We stay together." The slap came so fast her ears rang. Rose screamed. Caleb lunged forward, but Clara held him back, tasting blood. $20. The voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Everything went quiet. At the edge of the crowd stood a tall man in a weathered coat, hat shadowing his face. He stepped forward slowly. "I said 20, he repeated. Whispers rippled. 20 was more than anyone had fetched all day. "Sold," the gavel cracked. Clara swayed. Relief and terror tangled in her chest. The man did not smile. Did not leer. He simply turned and walked toward his wagon. "Come," he said calmly. His name, she remembered now, was Samuel Reed, a widower from outside town. As Clara climbed into the wagon with her children, gossip followed them like smoke. "Reed's lost his mind, buying damaged goods. Wonder what he really wants." Clara's stomach twisted. She glanced sideways at the man who now owned her freedom. "Sir," she began, voice trembling, "what do you expect from me?" He didn't look at her. "Work, respect, honesty. And at night," the question slipped out in a whisper. Now he looked at her. "You and your children will sleep in the house. I sleep in the barn." She blinked. "The barn? I didn't buy you for that." His jaw tightened. "I bought you because no one else would." Silence stretched between them as the prairie opened wide and endless ahead. Clara looked back at the shrinking town, at the place that had laughed while her life was priced like livestock. Her heart pounded. Who was this man, and why did he spend $20 he clearly couldn't afford? As the wagon rolled toward an uncertain horizon, Clara pressed her hand over her unborn child and whispered to herself, "Whatever comes next, we endure." But she couldn't shake the feeling that the real trial had only just begun. The ranch was smaller than Clara expected. When Samuel Reed guided the wagon over the last rise, the land unfolded into a lonely stretch of prairie dotted with stubborn patches of green. A modest cabin leaned slightly to one side, as if exhausted from standing alone too long. The barn sagged in the middle. A crooked fence struggled to contain a handful of cattle that looked just as weary as the buildings. This was what $20 had bought her, or maybe this was what $20 had saved her from. Samuel climbed down first. "Careful," he muttered without looking at her. Caleb jumped down, then reached up for Rose with a seriousness that made Clara's throat tighten. He was trying so hard to be a man, too hard. Clara eased herself off the wagon, one hand supporting her heavy belly. The baby shifted inside her, a slow, stubborn roll. Samuel stood facing the cabin for a long moment. "It's not much," he said finally. "It's a palace compared to the poorhouse," Clara answered softly. A faint sound escaped him, not quite laughter, not quite sorrow, something in between. Inside, dust coated everything. The fireplace was cold, the table bare. One narrow bed pressed against the far wall. The air carried the scent of old wood and something deeper, something left behind. Rose made a small, wounded sound. "Mama," Clara forced brightness into her voice. "Well, we've got four walls and a roof. That's more than yesterday." Caleb glanced at Samuel. Are we allowed to touch things?" Samuel stiffened slightly, then nodded once. "It's your home now. Your home now." The words echoed strangely. Clara stepped toward the fireplace and ran her finger along the mantel, leaving a clean line through the dust. "Caleb, see if there's wood outside. Rose, help me shake out these blankets." They moved quickly, instinct, survival. Samuel disappeared into the barn without another word. By late afternoon, smoke curled from the chimney. The children swept. Clara scrubbed surfaces slowly, her back aching, her feet swollen. Sweat trickled down her spine, but she didn't stop. Work steadied her. Work kept fear quiet. The cabin began to breathe again. When Samuel returned, he carried a sack of flour and dried beans. He set them on the table. "There's a well out back," he said. "Water's clean, 6 hens in the coop, gardens mostly dead but soil's still good." "Thank you," Clara replied. He hesitated at the doorway. "My wife kept it better," he said roughly. "Before," Clara stilled. "How long?" 3 years, 2 months. His jaw tightened. "Fever, the same fever." The silence between them shifted. "I'm sorry," she said. He gave a small shake of his head. "Don't be," but his voice betrayed him. That evening they ate thin bean soup on the floor. There weren't enough chairs. Caleb tried to sit like Samuel, straight-backed and quiet. Rose actually giggled when Clara gave her an extra spoonful. That soft giggle cracked something open in Clara's chest. "Oh, there it is," she thought, the sound of a child being a child again. "Is this home now?" Rose whispered. Clara stroked her hair. "Yes, baby, this is home." Samuel stood abruptly. "I'll be in the barn." Clara watched him leave, the door creaking shut behind him. The barn, he truly meant it. That night Clara locked the cabin door from the inside. Samuel had pointed out the latch earlier, almost awkwardly. "If it makes you feel safer." She lay on the narrow bed while Caleb and Rose slept bundled on the floor near the fire. Outside, the prairie wind whispered against the cabin walls. Inside, the baby kicked sharply. Clara pressed her palm to her stomach. "Easy," she murmured. "We're safe." "Are we?" Her mind replayed the auction, the laughter, the slap, then Samuel's voice. $20. Why? Men did nothing without reason. She had learned that lesson too well. What did he truly want? Morning came before she felt ready. A knock at the door. "Daylight's wasting," Samuel called through the wood. Caleb scrambled up instantly, eager. Clara dressed carefully, every movement slow and deliberate. Outside, Samuel handed Caleb a coil of rope. "Fence lines broken north side. You'll help me mend?" Caleb's chest puffed. "Yes, sir." Samuel paused. "Don't rush to grow up, boy. The world'll push you soon enough." Something flickered across Caleb's face. Gratitude, maybe relief. Clara stood watching them walk toward the pasture together. For the first time since Henry died, she didn't feel completely alone. The day unfolded in steady labor. She cleaned the well bucket, turned the soil in the neglected garden patch despite her back screaming in protest. Rose carried small stones away one by one. By noon, her hands were blistered. Her dress damp with sweat, but something was changing. The cabin smelled less like dust and more like bread baking. When Samuel and Caleb returned for midday meal, both were streaked with dirt. Samuel nodded at the table. Smells good. It was only cornbread and beans, but he ate as if it were a feast. Caleb spoke between bites. He showed me how to tie the wire so it won't snap in wind. Samuel shot him a sideways glance. Don't brag. Wind's meaner than you think. Rose giggled. Samuel almost smiled. Almost. That night after the children slept, Clara stepped outside. The sky stretched endlessly above, stars scattered like spilled salt. Samuel sat on an overturned bucket near the barn, staring toward the dark horizon. You don't have to sleep out here, she said softly. He didn't turn. I can't sleep in that bed, she understood. Grief lived in that cabin. Grief and ghosts. Samuel, she ventured, why did you really buy us? He was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, because no one deserves to be laughed at like that. His voice broke just slightly. And because, he swallowed, I was tired of eating alone. The words hung in the night air. Clara's heart squeezed painfully. This wasn't a man who bought a woman. This was a man drowning quietly. She stepped closer, not touching, not yet. Then maybe, she whispered, we can help each other stay afloat. He didn't respond, but he didn't move away either. And somewhere in the dark prairie, under a sky too wide for sorrow alone, something fragile began to shift. But just as hope started to breathe, the hoofbeats echoed faintly in the distance. And Clara felt her stomach drop. Trouble was coming, and it was coming fast. The hoofbeats grew louder, not one horse, several. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The baby inside her twisted sharply, as if sensing the fear flooding her veins. Samuel stood slowly from the overturned bucket. His posture changed in an instant, shoulders straightening, jaw tightening. The softness from moments ago vanished like smoke. Inside, he said quietly. Clara didn't argue. She hurried toward the cabin, her hand instinctively reaching for Caleb and Rose, who had rushed to the doorway. The riders burst into view through the rising dusk dust. Frank Callahan. Clara knew that face. Everyone in Briar Hollow did. The man who held half the mortgages in the county. The man who smiled while tightening a noose. He pulled his horse to a slow stop in front of the cabin, rain clouds gathering behind him like an omen. Two men flanked him, both grinning with lazy cruelty. Well now, Frank drawled, Samuel Reed. I heard a rumor in town and figured I'd come see it with my own eyes. Samuel didn't move. You've seen it. You can leave. Frank's eyes shifted to Clara, then deliberately down to her swollen belly. He chuckled. Ha ha ha, slow and filthy. $20, Sam, that's what you spent on her. Clara felt heat crawl up her neck. Caleb's fists clenched at her sides. Mind your mouth, Samuel said. Frank raised his hands mockingly. Easy. Just business talk. He dismounted, boots crunching against gravel as he approached. You're 2 months behind on your payment, Frank continued casually. And I hear you've taken on additional expenses. Samuel's silence was answer enough. Frank circled slowly, eyeing the barn, the mended fence, the smoke from the chimney. You planning to pay me with chickens? He sneered. We'll make it right, Samuel replied. Frank laughed again. You think that woman's going to plow fields in that condition? Clara stepped forward before fear could stop her. We work, she said firmly. We earn what we owe. Frank's gaze snapped to her, surprised at her voice. Well, she talks, he muttered. Samuel moved slightly in front of her without thinking. It was small, but Clara noticed. I'll give you till the end of the month, Frank said finally. After that, this land is mine. He leaned closer to Samuel. And if you default, I don't care what paperwork you've scribbled. That woman and her brats won't stay here. Caleb made a low sound in his throat. Samuel's hand tightened into a fist. Frank smiled, satisfied with the tension he'd planted. He turned, mounted his horse, and with a flick of the reins rode off with his men. Dust settled slowly. Silence fell heavier than before. Clara's knees weakened. Inside, Samuel murmured again. Once the door shut, Caleb exploded. I can work. I'll work harder than any man. He can't take this place. Samuel knelt in front of him. You will work. But not because you're afraid, because it's yours too now. Caleb blinked rapidly, trying not to cry. Rose clung to Clara's skirt, whispering, Mama, are we going back to the auction? The words sliced through Clara's chest. No, she said fiercely. Never. That night the wind rose. Samuel didn't go to the barn. He stayed near the cabin door, rifle resting across his knees, eyes on the dark horizon. Clara noticed. She pretended not to. The days that followed blurred into relentless labor. Samuel and Caleb repaired fence after fence. Clara planted seeds in the garden patch with swollen fingers, her back screaming, sweat dripping down her temples. Rose followed behind, patting soil over each tiny hope. Work, 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 the baby grew heavier. Each step felt like dragging stone, but something else grew too, connection. Samuel began eating at the table instead of standing near the doorway. He asked Caleb's opinion about the north pasture. He showed Rose how to collect eggs without startling hens. She giggled when one flapped wildly, and Samuel, to everyone's surprise, actually laughed. A short burst, rough and rusty. Ha ha ha, it startled him as much as it did them. Clara caught that moment and tucked it away inside her heart. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the prairie, Samuel handed Caleb the rifle. Clara's breath caught. You ever shot? Samuel asked. Caleb shook his head. Good. Means you won't be careless. He showed the boy how to hold it, how to breathe steady. You don't pull, Samuel instructed quietly. You squeeze, slow, gentle, Caleb nodded seriously. Clara watched from the porch, one hand resting on her belly. Her son was learning how to defend a home, tears stung her eyes. Later that night, when the children slept, Clara found Samuel by the fence line. You're teaching him to fight, she said softly. I'm teaching him to protect, Samuel corrected. She hesitated. Frank won't wait quietly, she said. I know, you could lose everything. Samuel stared out into the dark fields. I already did, he replied. The rawness in his voice made her chest ache. You don't have to face it alone, she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked. The moonlight caught the gray threading through his hair, the exhaustion in his eyes. I didn't buy you to be my burden, he said, and I didn't come here to be one. Silence. Then, almost without thinking, she reached for his hand. He flinched at first, then he let her hold it. His palm was rough, warm, steady. Not ownership, not obligation, something else, something fragile. The baby kicked hard between them. Samuel glanced down instinctively. When? He asked quietly. 2 months, maybe less, he swallowed. We'll make sure there's a cradle, he said. Not if, we will. That night, for the first time, Samuel did not sit outside the cabin. He remained on the porch, close, not touching. But close enough that Clara could hear his breathing through the thin walls. And for the first time since Henry's death, she slept. But dawn would not bring peace. Because as the sun rose 3 days later, smoke rose from the north pasture. And Clara's scream tore across the prairie. Samuel, Clara didn't remember running. She only remembered the smell, burning wood, burning grass, burning hope. Smoke curled violently from the north pasture where they had spent 3 full days repairing fence. Flames licked along the dry posts, snapping and hissing as wind fed them greedily. Caleb was already sprinting ahead of her. Caleb, stop, she cried, but the boy didn't slow. Samuel burst from the barn with 2 buckets, face hard as stone. He didn't waste a second asking questions. Water, he shouted. Caleb grabbed a 3rd bucket without hesitation. Rose stood frozen near the cabin, eyes wide, hands trembling. Mama, it's all burning. Clara's chest tightened painfully, but she forced her feet to move. She hauled water from the well, sloshing it across crackling boards. The baby shifted violently inside her with each jerking step. The fire wasn't an accident. Fence posts didn't ignite themselves at dawn. Samuel's jaw flexed as he worked. Frank, it was written in the smoke. For nearly an hour they fought it, Samuel and Caleb stamping out flames, Clara pouring water until her arms shook uncontrollably. Finally, mercifully, the wind shifted. The fire died. What remained was blackened earth and half their hard work reduced to ash. Caleb stared at the damage, chest heaving. He did this, he said, voice thick with fury. He's trying to scare us. Samuel wiped soot across his forehead. He is. Are we scared? Caleb asked. Samuel looked at him carefully. Yes, he answered honestly, but we're still here. Clara pressed her hand to her belly, breathing slowly through sharp, tightening pain that gripped her lower back. Not now. Please, not now. The baby settled after a moment, but fear lingered. That night Samuel didn't pretend. He brought the rifle inside. He checked the door twice. Caleb sat by the window long after dark, watching shadows like a guard twice his age. Clara lay awake listening to the wind, listening for hoofbeats, listening for destruction. But instead of horses, there was a knock, soft, unexpected. Samuel stiffened and moved toward the door silently, rifle raised. "Who is it?" he called. "It's Martha," came a woman's voice. From town, Clara blinked. Samuel opened the door cautiously. Martha Pritchard stood there, wrapped in a shawl, cheeks flushed from the ride. Behind her, another wagon waited, and behind that, two more, women, six of them, all staring at the burned pasture. "We heard," Martha said quietly. Clara swallowed. "He burned it." Martha nodded grimly. "Frank's been bragging at the mercantile, said he'd light a fire under Reed's stubborn pride." Samuel's face darkened. Martha turned to the women behind her. "Unload." Without ceremony, they began lifting supplies from the wagons, wood, tools. Seeds, even a small crate of fresh chicks. Clara stared in disbelief. "Why are you helping us?" one older woman snorted. "Because we're tired of watching that man bully half the county," another added softly, "and because we remember what it feels like to be alone." Samuel stood rigid, uncomfortable with the attention. "You don't owe us," he muttered. Martha met his gaze firmly. "Maybe not, but sometimes doing what's right isn't about debt." Clara felt tears spill freely now. Mercy still lived somewhere. The women worked through the afternoon, rebuilding what had burned. Martha handed Clara a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "For the baby," she said. Inside was a tiny knitted blanket. Clara's breath hitched. She clutched it to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, weeping openly now. Samuel watched her. Something shifted in his expression. That night after the women left, the north pasture stood half repaired again, stronger than before. Samuel stepped onto the porch beside Clara. "They didn't have to do that," he said. "No," she replied. "They chose to," he exhaled slowly. "I've spent 3 years believing this land was just dirt and debt," he admitted. "Maybe I was wrong. It's more," Clara said softly. "It's a chance." He glanced at her belly. The baby kicked again, and then pain, sharp, sudden. Clara gasped and gripped the railing. Samuel's head snapped toward her. "What is it?" "It's just," she inhaled sharply as another wave tightened around her spine. "It's too early." Caleb and Rose rushed out of the cabin. "Mama," Rose whimpered. Clara forced a breath. "It's just a cramp," but her hands trembled. Samuel stepped closer instinctively, steadying her elbow. The contact was firm, protective. The pain eased after a long, terrible minute. Samuel didn't let go. "Inside," he murmured gently. She didn't protest. That night he didn't sleep at all. He sat in the chair beside her bed, rifle resting against his knee, watching her breathe, watching her live, watching the small rise and fall of the blanket over her stomach. At some point near dawn, Clara woke and found him there. "You'll fall over tomorrow," she whispered weakly. He shook his head. "You're not facing anything alone again," he said. The words were simple, but they settled deep in her chest. Morning light crept through the window. For a brief, fragile moment, it felt like maybe they could survive this. But peace never lasted long in Briar Hollow, because later that afternoon a deputy rode up the path. And this time he wasn't coming with threats, he was coming with papers. The deputy removed his hat slowly. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Men only took their hats off for death or for bad news, dressed politely. Samuel stepped forward, shoulders squared. "What is it, deputy?" The man cleared his throat. "Samuel Reed, you are being summoned to appear before the county court tomorrow morning." Clara's stomach dropped. "On what charge?" Samuel asked evenly. The deputy hesitated. "Assault. Mr. Frank Callahan claims you attacked him 3 nights ago near his property line." Caleb made a sharp sound. "That's a lie." "It is," Samuel agreed calmly. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "I don't doubt it. But he's filed an official complaint, says you threatened him with a weapon." "I did no such thing," Samuel replied. "Then you'll say that in court." The paper in the deputy's hand seemed heavier than lead. "If you don't appear," he added quietly, "the warrant becomes active." Clara felt the baby twist hard, as if reacting to her fear. "When do you leave?" she asked. "Now," the deputy answered before Samuel could speak. "Judge wants him in town before nightfall." Rose burst into tears. Caleb stepped in front of Samuel as if to block him from being taken. Samuel knelt in front of his son. "Look at me," he said gently. Caleb's chin trembled. "You remember what I told you about courage?" Caleb nodded stiffly. "It isn't about not being afraid," Samuel continued. "It's about standing anyway. Clara swallowed tears that threatened to spill. Samuel rose and turned to her. For a second, the world narrowed, just the two of them. If he wins this, she whispered, he takes everything. I know, and if the judge believes him, I know. Her breath hitched. He stepped closer. Clara, he said quietly, if something goes wrong, if they try to hold me, don't, she cut in, her voice breaking. Don't speak like that. He hesitated. Then, without warning, he lifted his hand and cupped her face. The touch was firm, steady. You made this place alive again, he said softly. No matter what happens, that won't disappear. Her vision blurred with tears. She wanted to say so much. Instead, she whispered, come back to us. He nodded once. Then he turned and mounted the deputy's horse. Caleb stood stiff beside Clara as they watched him ride away. The prairie felt endless, empty, too quiet. Rose clutched Clara's skirt. Mama, what if they put him in jail? Clara didn't have an answer, so she gave the only one she could. Then we fight. The word surprised even her. That evening felt longer than any she had known. Clara moved through the cabin like someone underwater, slow, deliberate, heavy. She fed the chickens, stirred thin soup. Folded tiny baby clothes Martha had brought. The baby kicked again, strong, persistent. You're not scared, she murmured softly, pressing her hand to her belly. You're braver than I am. Caleb sat by the door with Samuel's rifle across his lap. I won't let anyone in, he said fiercely. Clara knelt in front of him. You're still a child. I'm the man here now. Her heart shattered quietly at those words. She pulled him into her arms. No, she whispered fiercely into his hair. You are still my boy and you deserve to stay one. He held her tightly. Later, as dusk settled, hoofbeats echoed again. Clara's heart nearly stopped. She grabbed the rifle from Caleb and stepped outside, but it wasn't Frank, it was Martha, and behind her more women, 8 this time, faces determined. What's happened? Clara asked breathlessly. We heard about the court summons, Martha replied. Callahan's been buying witnesses. Clara's stomach twisted. Witnesses, 2 ranch hands who owe him money. They'll swear Samuel threatened him with a gun. That's a lie, we know. Martha dismounted and stepped closer. So we're not letting him fight alone. The women began speaking over one another. My husband was there the night Callahan bragged about setting the fire. I saw him ride near your pasture that morning. He's bullied this county for years. Clara blinked rapidly. You testify, she whispered. Martha met her gaze. Yes, emotion surged so suddenly Clara had to grip the porch railing to stay upright. You barely know us, she said. Martha's eyes softened. Maybe, but we know injustice when we see it. Rose tugged at Clara's dress. Mama, are they helping? Clara swallowed tears. Yes, baby, they are. The women stayed late into the night, planning, gathering names, deciding who would stand in court. For the first time since Henry's death, Clara felt something dangerous. Hope. The next morning, Clara insisted on going to town. Samuel had told her to stay. She ignored him. I won't hide, she told Caleb firmly. Not again. Martha's wagon carried them to the courthouse. The building loomed larger than she remembered. Crowds gathered outside. Whispers followed her steps. There she is. That's the auction woman. Reed married trouble. Caleb's hand slipped into hers. Inside the courtroom, Samuel stood alone at the front. His face was bruised from lack of sleep, but when he saw her, relief flooded his eyes. Clara, he breathed. She moved to sit beside him. You weren't supposed to come, he murmured. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Frank Callahan entered with his lawyer, smug and polished. The judge called the court to order. The first witness took the stand. He spoke smoothly, too smoothly. Claimed Samuel rode onto Callahan's land with a rifle raised. Clara felt her pulse hammering in her ears. Then Martha stood. Your Honor, she said clearly. I have testimony that contradicts this claim. Murmurs filled the room. Frank's face darkened. The judge nodded reluctantly. Proceed. Martha described the night Frank bragged in the mercantile. Another woman stepped forward, describing seeing Frank near the pasture before the fire, then a third and a fourth. The courtroom shifted. Whispers turned into stunned silence. Frank rose abruptly. They're lying, are they? The judge asked coldly. Clara felt Samuel's hand brush hers under the bench. Not ownership, strength. The judge banged his gavel. I find insufficient evidence to hold Mr. Reed. Charges dismissed. The sound echoed like thunder. Clara gasped. Rose burst into tears of joy. Caleb let out a breath he'd been holding since yesterday. Frank's face burned red. This isn't over, he hissed. Samuel stepped forward, calm and steady. It is for today. Outside the courthouse, sunlight poured across the street. Clara stepped into it and felt warmth flood her skin. Samuel turned to her. You shouldn't have come, he said again. And miss watching you win, she replied softly. For the first time since she met him, he smiled fully, not small, not hidden, a real smile. Ha ha ha, a breath of relief escaped him, half laugh, half disbelief. They were still standing. But as they climbed back into Martha's wagon, a sharp pain ripped through Clara's abdomen. She doubled over with a cry. Samuel caught her instantly. Clara, her breath came fast, too fast. It's time, she whispered, and this time it wasn't a false alarm. It's time. The words barely left Clara's lips before another wave of pain tore through her body. Samuel caught her before her knees could buckle. His hands were strong, steady, but his eyes betrayed him. Fear, real, raw fear. Now, he asked, his voice rough. Clara tried to breathe through it. Too early, it's too early, Martha was already shouting orders. Get her in the wagon, move. Caleb and Rose scrambled in first, pale and trembling. Samuel lifted Clara as if she weighed nothing, though she felt heavier than the earth itself. The ride back to the ranch was agony. Every bump of the wagon sent fire up her spine. Sweat soaked her dress. She gripped Samuel's arm so tightly her nails dug into his skin. It's all right, he murmured over and over, though his jaw was tight as iron. I've got you, I've got you. By the time they reached the cabin, Clara could barely stand. Martha and two other women had followed close behind. Boil water, one shouted. Rose stood frozen near the door. Caleb ran for wood without being told. Samuel carried Clara inside and laid her on the narrow bed, the same bed he hadn't slept in since his wife's death. He didn't hesitate now, the room filled with motion. Cloth torn into strips, water steaming, Martha kneeling beside Clara with calm authority. You breathe with me, Martha instructed gently. In, out, good girl. Clara clutched the knitted blanket Martha had given her weeks ago. I can't, she gasped as another contraction slammed through her. Yes, you can, Samuel said firmly, gripping her hand. You've survived worse than this. She let out a cry, not quiet, not controlled, a cry ripped straight from her soul. Outside the door, Caleb paced like a caged animal. Rose sobbed softly, whispering prayers she barely understood. Hours blurred, pain swallowed everything. Clara felt as though she were being torn apart from the inside. At one point she locked eyes with Samuel. If I don't, she started weakly. Don't, he cut her off sharply, his voice breaking. You are not leaving me. Me. The word settled somewhere deep even as another scream tore from her throat. Then a sudden silence, a terrible, breathless pause. Clara's heart froze. Why isn't it crying? She whispered. The room held its breath. Martha worked quickly, hands steady but urgent. Come on, little one, she murmured. 1 second, 2, 3, then a cry, thin at first, then louder, strong, alive. Clara collapsed back against the pillow, sobbing openly now. Samuel let out a broken laugh, half choked, half astonished. Ha ha ha, he didn't even seem aware of the sound. Martha wrapped the tiny child in the knitted blanket and placed the baby gently against Clara's chest. A girl, she said softly. Clara stared down at the small, red-faced miracle. 10 fingers, 10 toes, fighting lungs. Hello, Clara whispered, tears streaming freely. Hello, my brave girl. Samuel stood frozen for a moment, then he stepped closer, slowly, as if approaching something sacred. Clara looked up at him. Meet your daughter, she said. The words hung in the air, your daughter. His throat worked. He reached out one careful finger and touched the baby's tiny hand. The infant gripped him instantly. Samuel inhaled sharply as though struck in the chest. She's strong, he murmured. She has to be, Clara whispered. She's ours, ours. He swallowed hard. Outside, Caleb burst into the room the moment Martha allowed it. Is Mama okay? I'm right here, Clara smiled weakly. He stepped closer and stared at the baby. She's small, he said softly, but loud, Rose added, sniffing. The baby let out another fierce cry as if to prove the point. Laughter filled the cabin, real laughter this time, relief, wonder. All life had pushed back against fear. That night the cabin felt different, full, warm. Samuel didn't leave for the barn. He stayed. He built up the fire. He sat beside Clara as she drifted in and out of sleep, the baby resting against her chest. At some point in the quiet darkness, Clara woke. Samuel was still awake, watching them both. You're staring, she murmured faintly. I almost lost this, he said quietly. Before it even began, she reached for his hand. You didn't, she replied. He hesitated, then leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, not hesitant, not distant, intentional. Thank you, he whispered. For what? For choosing to stay, Clara smiled weakly. For buying us, he shook his head slowly. For becoming my family. Tears slipped silently down her temples. The baby stirred between them. Outside, the prairie wind moved gently through tall grass. For the first time since the auction, since the fire, since the threats, peace settled over the small cabin. But peace in Briar Hollow never lasted without a price. Because 3 days later, Frank Callahan rode back onto their land, and this time he didn't come alone. The baby was only 3 days old when the dust rose again on the horizon. Clara was sitting near the fireplace, her daughter tucked against her chest, when Caleb's voice cut through the quiet. They're coming, her heart stopped. Samuel was already on his feet. Through the window, 3 riders approached, Frank Callahan in the lead, 2 men behind him. And this time they weren't pretending. Samuel stepped outside before they reached the porch. Clara stood slowly despite the ache in her body and moved to the doorway, the baby wrapped tightly in Martha's knitted blanket. Caleb stood beside her, Rose clung to her skirt. Frank dismounted with deliberate slowness. Well, he drawled, heard you had yourself a little celebration. His eyes flicked toward Clara and the baby. Samuel's posture hardened. State your business. Frank held up a folded paper. Foreclosure notice. The word landed like a gunshot. Clara's grip tightened instinctively around her daughter. You're a month behind, Frank continued smoothly. And after the court embarrassment you caused me, I've decided to collect. You lost in court, Samuel said evenly. I lost the assault charge, Frank corrected, not the debt. He stepped closer. You think a few town women standing up changes anything, the note is still due. Clara felt the air thinning around her. We've made payments, Samuel replied, not enough. Frank's men began riding toward the barn without asking permission. Caleb lunged forward. Samuel grabbed his shoulder firmly. No, the barn door creaked open. Tools were dragged out. Crates overturned. The sound of breaking wood echoed across the yard. Stop this, Clara cried out. Frank looked at her lazily. You should have thought about that before you cost me my reputation. My husband defended me, she shot back fiercely. Frank smiled thinly. And now he can defend you from poverty. Samuel stepped forward, rage burning behind his eyes. Touch that barn again and you'll regret it. Frank leaned close, voice low and venomous. You think I'm afraid of you? No, Samuel said calmly, but you should be. For a split second, something flickered in Frank's expression, then hoofbeats, more than 3. Clara turned sharply, dust rose from the road again. But this time it wasn't Frank's men. It was half the town, wagons, riders, farmers, women, Martha in front, behind her nearly 30 people. They spread out across the yard surrounding the barn. Frank blinked in disbelief. What is this? He snapped. Martha dismounted with slow precision. This, she said clearly, is a settlement. A man Clara recognized from the mercantile stepped forward holding a ledger. We've pooled the remainder of Samuel Reed's debt, he announced. Frank's face drained of color. You can't be serious. Oh, we are, Martha replied coolly. A heavy pouch of coins was placed in Frank's hand. Every cent owed, the merchant said. Frank stared at it as if it burned. You think this changes anything, he spat. Yes, Samuel answered quietly. It means you have no claim left. Frank's jaw twitched. He looked around at the circle of townsfolk, at the men who once stayed silent, at the women who once whispered, now standing together. You'll regret crossing me, he muttered. Martha smiled faintly. You already regret underestimating us. Frank mounted his horse with sharp, jerking movements. This isn't over. It is, Samuel replied steadily. Frank rode off, his men scrambling after him. Silence lingered for a moment. Then applause, not loud but steady. Clara felt her knees weaken. Samuel turned to her. It's paid, he said softly. It's ours. It's ours. She let out a shaky laugh, half sob, half disbelief. Ha ha ha, it sounded strange and beautiful all at once. Caleb whooped. Rose clapped excitedly. The baby stirred and let out a fierce cry as if claiming the land herself. Martha approached Clara gently. You're free, she said. The word echoed deep, free, no auction block, no foreclosure, no threats. Samuel stepped onto the porch. For the first time since Clara met him, he looked unburdened, not just relieved, Unburdened, he looked at the gathered townsfolk. "Thank you," he said simply. A farmer shrugged. "You'd have done the same." Samuel glanced at Clara. He nodded slightly. Yes, he would have. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Martha lingered. "You two going to make this place thrive now?" she asked. Samuel smiled faintly. "We already started." That evening the prairie glowed gold in the setting sun. Clara sat on the porch with her newborn in her arms. Caleb and Rose chased each other through tall grass. Samuel stepped beside her. "Have you chosen her name?" he asked softly. Clara looked down at the tiny face. "Yes," she met his eyes. "Hope," he inhaled slowly. "Hope Reed," he repeated. The name felt right, strong, defiant, alive. He sat beside her. Not distant, not guarded, close. The wind moved gently through the grass. The barn stood intact. The pasture would regrow. The debt was gone. Clara leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. "You didn't just buy us," she said quietly. He turned slightly toward her. "No," he agreed. "You rescued me." Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from fear, not from shame, from gratitude, from awe, from the realization that sometimes, out of humiliation, out of ashes, out of almost losing everything, something extraordinary can grow. Samuel slipped his arm around her carefully. The baby stirred between them, and under a sky vast and endless, they finally allowed themselves to breathe. The auction had tried to strip her dignity. The fire had tried to destroy her home. The law had tried to divide them, but love, quiet, stubborn, fierce love, had done what none of those things could. It built something stronger, and this time it was theirs. Autumn came gently that year. The pasture that had once been black with ash now shimmered in gold and green. New grass pushed stubbornly through the burned earth, stronger than before. The fence stood firm. The barn roof had been repaired. The chickens clucked contentedly in their coop. Life had not just returned, it had taken root. Clara sat beneath the wide cottonwood near the cabin, little Hope cradled in her arms. The baby's cheeks were round now, her tiny fingers constantly reaching, always grasping for something new. Caleb was taller already, stronger. He moved across the yard with purpose when Samuel called his name. Rose laughed more than she cried. The sound of children's laughter drifted across the prairie like music. And inside the cabin, the ghosts were quieter. Samuel no longer slept in the barn. The first night he'd walked into the bedroom fully, really walked in, had been silent and sacred. He had stood beside the bed for a long time. Then slowly, carefully, he lay down beside Clara, not because grief was gone, but because life had grown bigger than it. Clara remembered the way his hand had trembled slightly before settling over hers. "I don't want to forget her," he'd whispered. "You don't have to," Clara had answered softly. "Love doesn't replace, it expands." He had closed his eyes then and finally slept. Now, months later, he stood at the fence watching Caleb struggle to lift a heavy post. "Shift your weight," Samuel called. Caleb adjusted. The post steadied. "There you go," Samuel nodded proudly. Clara watched the two of them with a smile she didn't try to hide. Not obligation, not survival, family. Hope stirred and let out a soft coo. Samuel turned immediately at the sound. He always did. He walked over and leaned down, brushing a rough finger against the baby's cheek. "She's going to rule this ranch one day," he murmured. Clara laughed softly. "With that voice." "Absolutely." Hope let out a loud, indignant cry as if agreeing. "Ha ha ha," Samuel chuckled. It was no longer rusty, it was warm, even easy. One afternoon, Martha rode up again. Clara stood to greet her. "You look peaceful," Martha observed with a knowing smile. Clara glanced toward Samuel and the children. "I think I am." Martha dismounted and studied the thriving ranch. "You know Frank sold half his holdings and left town," she said casually. Clara blinked. "He did. Turns out when enough people stop being afraid, bullies lose their power." Clara let that settle in her chest. It wasn't just about debt, or land, or courtrooms. It had been about fear and standing anyway. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara and Samuel sat on the porch under a sky streaked with stars. "You ever think about that day?" Samuel asked quietly. "The auction," she replied. He nodded. "Sometimes," she admitted. "So do I." She looked at him. "Do you regret it?" He turned toward her fully. "Buying you?" he asked softly. She swallowed. "Yes." He reached for her hand. "If I hadn't, I'd still be a man hiding from grief in a barn. Caleb wouldn't have someone teaching him to stand tall. Rose wouldn't laugh the way she does. And Hope," he smiled faintly. Hope wouldn't exist. Clara's throat tightened. And you, he asked gently, do you regret stepping into that wagon? She thought about the slap, the humiliation, the fear. Then she looked at her home, her husband, her children. No, she whispered, I regret the pain, but not the path. He leaned closer, careful, intentional, and kissed her, not hurried, not hesitant, deep, certain. She felt it all the way to her toes. Oh, this was not survival anymore, this was love. Strong, chosen, earned, Hope cried out inside the cabin. Samuel laughed softly. Duty calls. Clara stood with him. Not duty, she corrected with a smile. Joy. They stepped inside together. Years later, when people in neighboring towns spoke of Briar Hollow, they would mention the story. The widow sold at auction. The widower who paid $20, the fire, the courtroom. The town that finally stood up, but those who truly knew the story understood something deeper. It was never about being bought, it was about being chosen. Chosen in the face of cruelty, chosen in the face of fear. Chosen again and again, every day in small, quiet acts of courage. And every evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, Clara would watch her family move across the land that once nearly swallowed them. She would press her hand over her heart, and she would whisper the same prayer she'd spoken on that terrible platform long ago, not let us survive, but thank you for letting us live. Winter arrived early that year. The first frost clung to the fence posts like silver lace, and the prairie turned pale beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Clara stood at the cabin window, Hope bundled tightly in her arms, watching Samuel and Caleb haul firewood inside before the next storm rolled in. Life had grown steady, predictable, almost peaceful, and that was precisely why the knock on the door made her heart jump. Samuel opened it cautiously. Sheriff Dalton, not Frank Callahan, he was gone, but the county sheriff himself, hat in hand. Evening, Reed, he said quietly. Samuel's posture stiffened. Sheriff, Clara stepped closer, heart tightening. Is something wrong? The sheriff glanced behind him toward the yard as if ensuring they were alone. There's talk, he said. Callahan didn't just leave town, he's been stirring trouble up north, claiming he was cheated, claiming this ranch was taken from him unfairly. Samuel's jaw flexed. The debt was paid. I know, but he's spreading lies. Says you coerced witnesses, says you threatened townsfolk. Clara felt anger rise sharp and hot. After everything he did, she whispered. The sheriff nodded grimly. Most folks don't believe him, but a few investors up north might. Men with money, and money can stir up new claims. Samuel stepped outside with the sheriff, speaking low and tense. Clara stood frozen inside, hope stirring against her chest. Not again, please, not again. After a long moment, Samuel returned. What is it? She asked immediately. He closed the door carefully. Callahan's trying to challenge the sale of the debt, he said. If he can convince a judge that the community pooled funds illegally or pressured him, he might try to reopen the claim. Clara stared at him in disbelief. He can't, he can try. Caleb stepped into the room quietly. He had heard enough to understand. Are we going to lose the ranch? He asked. The question pierced the air. Samuel knelt again in front of his son just as he had months ago. No, he said firmly, we're not losing anything. But what if we face it? Samuel interrupted gently. Like we always have. Clara felt the baby's small fingers curl around hers. Hope. The name suddenly felt less like a gift and more like a test. The following weeks were heavy with tension. Letters arrived. Rumors drifted in from nearby towns. Samuel rode out twice to meet with the sheriff and the county clerk. Clara stayed busy tending to the garden's winter rest, mending clothes, rocking Hope through restless nights, but worry hummed under everything. One evening, as snow began to fall in soft, silent sheets, Samuel came in with frost in his beard and something strange in his expression. What? Clara asked immediately. He removed his gloves slowly. It's done, her breath caught. Done, the county reviewed everything, the ledger, the payment, the witnesses. Callahan has no standing, the sale was lawful. Clara's knees nearly gave out. So it's finished, she whispered. He nodded once. Finished. The room seemed to exhale. Caleb whooped so loudly Rose burst into laughter. Hope startled and let out a loud, indignant cry. Samuel laughed, full and unrestrained. Ha ha ha! Clara felt tears spill freely. Not from fear this time, from release. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, baby and all. He held them tightly, no hesitation, no distance. That night the snow covered the ranch in quiet white. The barn stood strong. The fence line stretched steady against the wind. The cabin glowed warmly from within. Later, when the children slept and Hope finally drifted off in her cradle, Clara and Samuel sat near the fire. You know, she said softly, if someone had told me that the worst day of my life would lead here, he glanced at her. I wouldn't have believed it either, she leaned against him, but I'm grateful for it. He tilted his head slightly. For the auction, for what came after, silence settled comfortably between them. After a moment he spoke again. I used to think grief was the end of a story, he admitted. That losing Emily meant the rest of my life would just be existing. Clara listened quietly. But you taught me something, she smiled faintly. What's that? That sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. Her chest tightened. In this one, she asked softly. He looked at the fire, then at her, then toward the cradle where Hope slept. This one, he said firmly, we write together. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, but inside, warmth held. Years would pass. Caleb would grow into a man whose strength came not from anger but from steadiness. Rose would bloom into a young woman whose laughter could lift any room. Hope would grow knowing she had been born into struggle and into fierce love. And Clara would sometimes close her eyes and remember standing on that wooden platform, humiliation burning like fire. She would remember the laughter, the slap, the fear. And then she would open her eyes to the life built from that very moment. Not purchased, not rescued, built brick by brick, choice by choice, love by love. And when people asked her years later how she survived it all, she would smile softly and answer, I didn't just survive. We stood. And in standing, they became unbreakable. Spring returned with rain, not the violent kind that threatened to wash everything away, but the steady, patient kind that seeps deep into the soil and coaxes new life from old roots. Clara stood barefoot in the damp grass one early morning, hope balanced on her hip, watching the sun rise over the land that had once nearly swallowed her whole. The prairie no longer looked endless and lonely. It looked full, full of labor. Full of laughter, full of memory. Samuel walked toward her from the barn, sleeves rolled, hair slightly disheveled, carrying a small wooden box. You're up early, he said softly. So are you, he smiled. Not the guarded half-smile she first knew, a real one. He handed her the box. What's this? Open it. Clara shifted Hope carefully and lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded paper, thick, official. She frowned slightly and unfolded it. Her breath caught the deed, not a debt agreement, not a payment schedule, the deed fully transferred in both their names. She looked up at him, stunned. When? She whispered. Yesterday, he said. The clerk finalized it. Her fingers trembled as she read the inked names side by side, Samuel Reed, Clara Reed. She pressed the paper to her chest as tears welled up. It's truly ours, she breathed. It always was, he answered gently. We just made it official. Hope reached for the paper with curious fingers. Clara laughed softly through her tears. Careful, she murmured to the baby. That's your future you're grabbing. Samuel stepped closer. You know, he said quietly, when I first saw you on that platform, I didn't think I was buying anything. She looked at him. I thought I was saving someone, he continued. But I was the one being saved, Clara swallowed. And I thought I was being sold, she admitted. But I was being led. To what? He asked softly. She looked around them, at the garden beginning to bloom again, at Caleb mending the gate without being asked, at Rose humming while hanging laundry, at Hope squirming impatiently in her arms. To this, she whispered. Samuel brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. Would you change it? He asked. She thought for a long moment about humiliation. About fear, about nights of uncertainty. Then she shook her head slowly. No, he leaned down and kissed her, not urgent, not desperate, but grateful. That afternoon the townsfolk gathered at the ranch, not for trouble, not for court, but for a picnic. Martha arrived with fresh bread. The sheriff brought cider. Even the merchant who once kept silent during the auction now stood proudly among them. Children ran across the fields. Laughter carried far beyond the fence line. At one point, Caleb stood near Samuel, taller now, steadier. Do you ever wish we hadn't gone through all that? Caleb asked quietly. Samuel considered the question, then he shook his head. No, why not? Because hardship taught us who stands with us. Caleb nodded thoughtfully. And who doesn't, he added. Samuel smiled faintly. Exactly. Later, as the sun dipped low and painted everything in gold, Clara stood at the edge of the field with Martha. You were brave, Martha said softly. Clara smiled gently. I was terrified. Bravery doesn't mean you aren't afraid, Martha replied. It means you move anyway. Clara watched Samuel lift Hope high into the air, the baby squealing with delight. Ha ha ha, the sound of his laughter echoed openly across the land. She felt her heart swell until it almost hurt. There had been a time she believed her life had ended on that auction block, that she had been reduced to a price. But the truth. That day had not been an ending. It had been a doorway, a cruel one, a humiliating one, but still a doorway, and she had walked through it, head high. Years later, when Hope would be old enough to ask how her parents met, Clara would sit her down on this very porch. She would tell her about fear, about cruelty, about men who laughed. But she would also tell her about courage, about townsfolk who finally stood, about a widower who chose dignity over silence. And she would end the story with the same words every time. You are not defined by what the world tries to take from you. You are defined by what you build after. As twilight settled and lanterns were lit across the yard, Samuel wrapped an arm around Clara's shoulders. You're quiet, he murmured. I'm remembering, she said softly. Regretting, she looked at him, eyes warm. Never. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, the barn stood solid, the house glowed warmly, the land stretched wide and open. And in that wide-open space, they were no longer afraid. They were home. Years passed, not quickly, not easily, but faithfully. The seasons circled the ranch like old friends, planting, harvest, frost, thaw, and each year the land answered their labor with abundance. Caleb grew tall and broad-shouldered, his hands strong from honest work. Rose's laughter turned softer but never disappeared, and little Hope, who had arrived during fear and fire, grew into a bright-eyed girl who ran faster than the wind and asked questions about everything. The auction became a story. Not a wound, a story, but scars never fully vanish. One late summer evening, as the sky burned orange behind the fields, a rider appeared at the far edge of the property. Clara noticed first. Samuel saw it a second later. Caleb, now nearly a man, stepped instinctively toward the barn. The rider came slowly, no dust storm, no threat, just one man. When he drew closer, Clara felt her breath catch. Frank Callahan, older, thinner. No smugness left in his posture. Samuel stepped forward, calm but guarded. Frank dismounted awkwardly. He didn't look like a man in control anymore. He looked like a man carrying something heavy. I won't stay long, Frank said quietly. No arrogance, no drawl, just plain words. Samuel didn't answer. Frank looked toward the house, toward Clara, toward the children, then he removed his hat. I was wrong, he said. The words sounded strange in the open air. Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly. Frank swallowed. I lost everything up north, he continued. Investments, land, reputation. A bitter laugh escaped him. Turns out the way you treat people follows you. Clara felt something twist inside her chest. Not pity, not satisfaction, something complicated. I've had a lot of time to think, Frank went on, about what I did here. About the fire, the threats. Samuel's jaw flexed at that. Frank glanced at him briefly. I can't undo it, he admitted, but I needed to say it. Silence stretched long. The prairie wind moved softly between them. You nearly destroyed my family, Samuel said evenly. Frank nodded once. I know. And now, Clara asked quietly. Frank looked at her fully for the first time. There was no cruelty in his eyes now, only weariness. Now I leave for good, he said, but I didn't want to carry this with me. Caleb stepped closer to Samuel's side, protective, ready. Samuel placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. You should have said this years ago, Samuel said. I know, Frank replied. Another pause, then Samuel nodded once. You said it now. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was release. Frank climbed back onto his horse slowly. Take care of what you've built, he said quietly before turning away. They watched him ride off, not in fear, not in anger, just watching. When he disappeared over the rise, Rose exhaled loudly. That felt strange, she whispered. Clara nodded. Yes, it did. Caleb frowned. Do you forgive him? The question lingered in the air. Samuel looked at Clara. Clara looked at the land, then at her children. I don't forget, she said softly. But I don't carry it any more either, Samuel nodded. Forgiveness isn't about excusing harm, he added. It's about refusing to let it own you. Hope, now old enough to understand pieces of the story, looked up at Clara. Was he the man who laughed? She asked. Clara crouched down and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Yes, she said gently. Hope frowned slightly. Why would someone laugh at hurting people? Clara inhaled slowly. Because sometimes people mistake power for strength, she answered, but real strength looks different. Hope glanced toward Samuel and Caleb repairing the fence together. Like that, she asked. Clara smiled softly. Yes, she whispered. Like that night as the family gathered for supper, something felt lighter, not triumphant, not dramatic, just lighter. Samuel caught Clara's hand beneath the table. Are you all right? He asked quietly. She squeezed his fingers. Yes, after the children went to bed, they stepped outside together. The sky was vast and clear. You ever think about how close we came to losing all this? Samuel murmured. She nodded. Sometimes, and yet here we are, she leaned against him. Not because it was easy, she said softly, but because we didn't quit, he smiled faintly. $20, he murmured. She laughed gently. Best investment you ever made, he shook his head. No, he turned to her fully. Best choice. Tears pricked her eyes unexpectedly. After everything, humiliation, fire, courtrooms, debt, fear, they had not only survived. They had grown, they had chosen each other again and again. The auction had tried to reduce her to a price. Frank had tried to reduce Samuel to a debtor, but neither of them had allowed it. Instead, they built. Instead, they stood. Instead, they loved. And under the wide prairie sky, with the wind whispering through the tall grass and the house glowing warm behind them, Clara felt something she once thought impossible. Not just safety, not just relief, peace. And this time it wasn't fragile, it was earned. Years later, Clara would still wake sometimes before dawn, not because of fear, not because of pain, but because of memory. She would lie quietly beside Samuel, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, and for a brief moment she would see it again, the wooden platform, the crowd, the laughter, the sting across her cheek. The price, $2, then 20. She would open her eyes to the ceiling of her own home, to warmth, to safety, and she would exhale. One autumn morning, when Hope was nearly grown and Caleb had already begun speaking of building a house of his own on the western ridge, Clara stepped outside alone. The air carried the scent of harvest. Golden fields stretched farther than she could see. Samuel stood by the barn sharpening a blade, movements slow and steady. He looked older now. So did she, but there was strength in the lines of his face. Strength that had not been there the day he lifted his voice in that crowd. Hope ran across the yard, her laughter ringing bright and fearless. "Mama," she called, "come see." Clara turned just as Hope jumped onto the fence rail, balancing perfectly. "You'll fall," Clara teased. Hope grinned. "I won't." Samuel watched them both and smiled. That evening the family gathered for supper as they always did. Caleb spoke of plans, Rose shared news from town. Hope argued passionately about planting new apple trees near the creek. Clara sat quietly for a moment, watching them all, this table, these voices, this life. There had been a time when she believed none of it would exist. Samuel noticed her silence. "What is it?" he asked gently. She smiled softly. "I was just thinking about the first meal we ate here. Bean soup, thin, quiet, uncertain. And now?" he asked. She looked at the table overflowing with fresh bread, roasted vegetables, laughter, warmth. "Now we feast." Samuel's eyes softened. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the children wandered off into the cooling dusk, he found her standing near the old cottonwood tree. "You're remembering again," he said. She nodded. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up that day?" He considered that. "If I hadn't," he repeated. She nodded. "If you hadn't said 20, he looked out over the fields. "I might have kept living," he said slowly, "but I wouldn't have been alive." Her throat tightened. "And me," she whispered. He turned to her. "You would have survived," he said firmly. "Because you're stronger than anyone I've ever known." Tears filled her eyes. "But I wouldn't have known joy like this," she admitted. He stepped closer. "You brought that here," he murmured. She shook her head gently. "We both did." They stood there in silence as the sky deepened into violet. Fireflies flickered faintly near the tall grass. "You know," Samuel said quietly, "people still tell the story." "The auction?" she asked. He nodded. "They say it was the day this town changed." Clara smiled faintly. "It wasn't the auction that changed it," she replied. "It was the standing." He studied her. "Standing?" "Yes," she said softly. "Standing when it would have been easier to look away, standing when fear said stay silent." He reached for her hand. "And we kept standing." "Yes," she whispered. Hope's voice called in the distance. "Papa, Mama. Come look at the sunset." They walked together toward the ridge. The sky exploded into brilliant orange and pink. The land glowed. Caleb stood tall at the edge. Rose leaned against the fence. Hope spun with her arms outstretched. Clara stepped beside Samuel and watched her family bathed in golden light. For a long moment she said nothing, then softly, "I forgive them." Samuel glanced at her. "Who?" "Everyone who laughed." He held her gaze. "Why?" "Because if they hadn't," she began, then stopped. "If they hadn't, I wouldn't be here." He squeezed her hand gently. "You deserved better," she smiled. "I got better." The wind moved through the grass like a gentle hymn. The sun slipped below the horizon. And in that fading light, Clara felt something settle deep in her bones. Not survival, not triumph, completion. The story that began in humiliation had ended in dignity. The price once shouted in mockery had become a foundation. The fear that once swallowed her whole had transformed into strength passed down to her children. And when hope someday faced her own storms, because every generation does, Clara knew her daughter would remember. Not the auction, not the fire, not the threats, but the standing, the choosing, the building, and the quiet, stubborn love that had turned $20 into a lifetime. Clara leaned her head against Samuel's shoulder one last time as twilight embraced the land. "I think," she whispered, "this is what redemption feels like." Samuel smiled. "Yes," he said softly, "it is." The years did not slow, they deepened. Caleb built his house on the western ridge the following spring. It wasn't large, but it stood straight and proud against the wind. Samuel helped raise the beams, his hands steady even as age began to whisper in his joints. Clara stood below with Rose and Hope, watching father and son work side by side. "Looks like him," Rose murmured. "Who?" Clara asked. "Caleb," she said. "The way he sets his jaw when he's determined." Clara smiled. "He had to grow up too fast once," she said quietly. "I'm glad he gets to build slowly now." Hope leaned against the fence, eyes shining. "Will I build one too?" Samuel, overhearing from above, called down. "Only if you promise to build it stronger than mine." Hope grinned. "I will." The laughter drifted across the fields, blending with the steady rhythm of hammer against wood. That evening, as the family gathered near the half-finished house, Clara felt a strange tightening in her chest. Not pain, something heavier, time. She watched Samuel carefully descend from the roof beams, slower than he once would have. "You all right?" she asked when he reached the ground. He brushed dust from his sleeves. "Just catching my breath." She didn't push, but she noticed. Later that night, when the others had returned to the main house and the sky was thick with stars, Samuel remained seated at the kitchen table long after supper. Clara approached quietly. "You're thinking again," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "I was remembering the barn," he admitted. She tilted her head. "The first nights after you came," her chest tightened gently. "You wouldn't step inside," she whispered. "I didn't think I deserved to," he replied. She moved closer. And now, he looked around the room at the polished table, the well-used stove, the cradle long since stored away but never forgotten. "Now I know I was wrong." She reached for his hand. "You were grieving," she said. "I was hiding," he corrected gently. She squeezed his fingers. "And you stopped," he nodded, "because you wouldn't let me stay buried." Clara felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. "I didn't rescue you," she whispered. "You did," he said firmly, "just by standing." The word again, standing, it had followed them through everything. Caleb's house was completed before the first frost. The family gathered to celebrate. There was food, music. Neighbors who had once whispered now stood openly proud. Martha, older but still sharp-eyed, leaned toward Clara during the festivities. "You see what you started?" she asked quietly. Clara blinked. "Started, the courage," Martha clarified. "It spread." Clara looked around. Men who once kept silent now spoke up in town meetings. Women who once stood in shadows now ran businesses. The auction that once humiliated her had become the moment the town changed direction. "It wasn't just me," Clara said softly. Martha smiled knowingly. "Maybe not. But you were the spark." As twilight deepened and lanterns were lit, Hope pulled Clara aside. "Mama," she said gently, "do you ever wish it had been easier?" Clara looked at her daughter carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Why wasn't it?" Hope asked. Clara considered her answer. "Because easy doesn't always teach you who you are." Hope frowned thoughtfully. "And who are we?" Clara smiled. "We are people who stand." Hope nodded slowly. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and silence returned, Clara and Samuel walked to the ridge overlooking both houses. The prairie stretched endless beneath the moonlight, two homes now, two generations. Samuel took a long, slow breath. I never thought I'd see this, he admitted. Clara looked at him sharply. See what? Legacy, the word felt sacred. You built it, she said softly. He shook his head. We built it. They stood in silence for a long moment. The wind moved gently across the grass, crickets hummed. Somewhere in the distance, Caleb laughed. Samuel squeezed her hand. If that auction hadn't happened, he began quietly. Clara finished the thought. We would have been different people, he nodded, but I'm grateful for who we became, she leaned into him. So am I. They remained there until the stars shifted and the air cooled. And as they walked back down the ridge together, Clara felt something settle inside her heart. The story had not ended with survival. It had not ended with freedom. It had not even ended with forgiveness. It had grown into family. Into courage, into a town that remembered what happens when good people choose not to look away. And though time would continue its quiet march forward, though age would one day claim even the strongest hands, the foundation laid that day on the auction platform would never crumble. Because it had been built not from price, but from choice, and that kind of foundation endures. Winter came again, but this time it carried no fear. The snow fell thick across the prairie, softening fence lines and blanketing the fields in quiet white. Smoke rose steadily from two chimneys now, the main house and Caleb's place on the ridge. Clara stood by the window, watching Hope and Rose cross the yard wrapped in shawls, their laughter trailing behind them like music. Samuel entered quietly, brushing snow from his coat. Storm's settling in, he said. She turned toward him and smiled. We've weathered worse, he chuckled softly. That we have. They moved about the kitchen in practiced rhythm. She stirred stew, he split kindling. No rush, no tension, just the steady partnership they had built over years of standing shoulder to shoulder. After supper, Caleb came down from the ridge, stamping snow from his boots. Fence held, he announced proudly. Didn't budge an inch, Samuel nodded approvingly. You built it right, Caleb grinned. I learned from the best. Clara watched them both, her heart swelling. Later, when the storm intensified and wind howled against the walls, the family gathered near the fireplace. Hope curled beside Clara. Tell it again, she pleaded. Clara smiled knowingly. The story? Yes, Hope insisted. From the beginning, Samuel raised an eyebrow. You never get tired of it. Hope shook her head fiercely. Never. Clara glanced at Samuel for permission. He nodded, so she began. She told of the poorhouse, of the wooden platform. Of the cruel laughter, of the slap that stung not just her cheek but her pride. Hope's small hands tightened into fists. Caleb's jaw set even now. Rose blinked back tears, though she had heard it 100 times. And then, Clara continued softly, your father said $20. Hope looked at Samuel with shining eyes. Were you scared? She asked him. He nodded honestly. Yes. Then why did you do it? He looked at Clara before answering. Because sometimes doing nothing costs more than doing something. Hope frowned thoughtfully. And then, she urged. And then, Clara smiled, we chose to stand. She told of the fire, of the court, of the women who rode through the storm. Of the birth, of the debt paid, and finally of the land that became theirs. When she finished, silence settled gently over the room. The fire crackled, snow pressed softly against the windows. Hope looked up at Clara. Mama, she said quietly, you weren't sold. Clara's breath caught. No, she whispered, I was chosen. Samuel reached for her hand. Hope smiled. And we were born into courage. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. Not from sorrow, from pride. Later, after the children drifted to sleep, she and Samuel remained by the fire. You tell it softer now, he observed. She nodded. It doesn't hurt the same. He studied her face. Does it still hurt at all? She considered that. Only when I remember how alone I felt. He squeezed her hand. You weren't alone for long. No, she agreed softly, because you stepped forward. He smiled faintly. And you stepped into the wagon, she laughed gently. We both stepped. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, warmth held steady. Samuel leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. Do you ever think about the end? He asked quietly. Clara turned toward him. The end, he nodded. Of us, her chest tightened briefly. Yes, she admitted, and she reached for his hand again. When that day comes, she said softly, we'll have left something behind. He looked toward the ridge. Toward Caleb's house, toward Hope's future, toward the town that had changed. More than land, he murmured. Yes, she said, more than land. He leaned forward and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to her forehead, just as he had the night Hope was born. Not desperate, not fearful, grateful. I'd choose you again, he whispered, her breath caught. In every lifetime, she replied, the fire burned low, the wind howled less fiercely. And as Clara rested her head against his shoulder, she understood something she had not fully grasped before. Redemption is not a single moment. It is not a courtroom victory. It is not even the paying of a debt. Redemption is what happens when pain is transformed into purpose, when humiliation becomes strength, when fear becomes foundation. And as sleep slowly claimed them both, she knew this truth with quiet certainty. The story that began with a price had ended with priceless things, and no storm, not then, not ever, could take that away. Spring thaw came gently, but Samuel did not. Clara noticed it first in the small things. The way he paused longer before standing. The way he pressed a hand briefly against his chest when he thought no one was watching. The way his laughter, still warm, still easy, sometimes ended with a quiet breath drawn too carefully. She did not speak of it at first, she simply watched. One afternoon, as the prairie bloomed with wildflowers, Samuel sat beneath the cottonwood tree where Hope had once taken her first steps. Caleb was repairing a gate nearby. Rose was visiting from town. Hope, nearly grown now, was reading aloud from a worn book. Samuel listened with a soft smile. When Clara approached, he looked up at her as though memorizing something. You're staring again, she teased gently. Just thinking, he replied. About what? He took a slow breath. That I almost missed all this, her heart squeezed painfully. You didn't. I could have, he said quietly. If I'd kept hiding, she knelt beside him, brushing her hand over his. You didn't hide forever. No, he admitted, because you refused to let me. The wind carried the scent of new grass and warm earth. Samuel closed his eyes briefly. I used to believe grief was something you carried alone, he said softly, but you showed me it can be shared. Clara swallowed emotion. We carried it together, he nodded. And we built something better. That evening the family gathered on the porch. The sky was wide and gold. Hope leaned her head against Samuel's shoulder. Papa, she said softly, if I ever face something terrible, how do I know what to do? He smiled faintly. You stand, she looked up at him, even if I'm afraid, especially then. Clara felt tears threaten, the same lesson passed down. Samuel reached for her hand beneath the table. Later, when the children had gone inside and the last light slipped below the horizon, Samuel remained seated on the porch. Clara joined him quietly. You're tired, she said. He nodded. A little. Silence settled comfortably between them. You remember the first night here? He asked. She smiled faintly. You sleeping in the barn? He chuckled softly. I thought I was protecting you. You were, she said gently, but not from what I feared. He looked at her carefully. I was afraid I couldn't love again, he admitted. Her breath caught. And now, he reached up, brushing his thumb lightly along her cheek. Now I know love doesn't replace, it grows. Tears slipped down her face. Samuel, she began softly. He interrupted gently. Don't, she swallowed hard. I don't regret a single step, he whispered. Not the auction, not the fire, not the fight. Neither do I, she said, her voice trembling. He leaned his forehead gently against hers. If I had to stand there again, he murmured, I would still say 20. A broken laugh escaped her, ha, soft, full of memory. And I would still climb into that wagon, she replied. The stars began to appear overhead, one by one. Samuel exhaled slowly. Promise me something, he said quietly, anything. When I'm gone, don't let the story become only about pain. Her chest tightened sharply. Don't speak like that, it's part of life, he said gently. We stood against so much, but what matters is what we built after. She gripped his hand fiercely. I promise, she whispered. He smiled softly. That's all I need. They sat together in silence as crickets hummed in the grass. Inside, Hope's laughter echoed faintly. Caleb's deep voice answered. Rose's gentle tone followed. Samuel closed his eyes, listening. That, he said softly, is the sound of redemption. Clara rested her head against his shoulder. She felt his breathing slow, steady, peaceful, not afraid. And in that quiet moment, beneath a sky vast and unbroken, she understood something deeper than she ever had before. The story had never truly been about being sold. It had been about being seen, chosen, loved. And though time would one day carry them forward into different chapters, though seasons would shift and hands would age and children would build lives of their own, the foundation laid in courage would never crumble. Because it was not built on money or land or victory, it was built on standing when it would have been easier to fall. And that kind of legacy outlives even the strongest storms. Summer arrived heavy and bright. The field stood tall and green, wheat bending gently beneath the sun. Clara moved slower now, not from pregnancy this time, but from years lived fully. Samuel had taken to sitting more often beneath the cottonwood, watching the land instead of working it. Caleb handled most of the labor now. Hope rode confidently across the pasture, fearless and laughing. Rose visited often with news from town, how Briar Hollow had grown, how businesses were run by women who once stood silent, how people spoke more boldly in meetings than they ever had before. The ripple had lasted. One morning, Clara found Samuel standing alone at the ridge. He was looking toward the horizon, toward the place where the wagon had once disappeared with her inside it. "You're thinking again," she said softly. He smiled without turning. "About that day," she stepped beside him. "The auction." Yes, she let the memory surface gently, the platform, the shame, the laughter, and then his voice, $20. "I was angry that day," he admitted quietly. "At them, at myself," she looked at him. "For hiding from the world so long," he continued. "For thinking my grief gave me permission to do nothing." She slipped her hand into his. "It wasn't nothing," she said gently. "It was survival," he nodded. "But survival isn't living." "No," she agreed softly, "it isn't." They stood together as the wind moved across the tall grass. "You know what I remember most?" she asked. "What?" "The silence right before you spoke," he chuckled faintly. "I remember my heart pounding," she smiled. "I remember thinking, please, God, let us survive." "And now?" he asked quietly. She looked at their land. "At Caleb repairing the western fence. At Hope teaching two young children from town how to ride. At Rose kneeling beside the garden with Martha, laughing. Now I don't pray for survival," she said softly. "What do you pray for?" "For strength to keep standing." He squeezed her hand. "That prayer's already been answered." That afternoon, Samuel asked Caleb to walk with him. Clara watched from the porch as father and son moved slowly toward the barn. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the weight of them. Caleb nodded several times. Then he embraced his father, not awkwardly like a boy, but firmly like a man. Clara felt her chest tighten. Later that evening, Samuel joined her on the porch. "You told him," she said quietly. He nodded. "He's ready." "For what?" "For carrying it forward." She looked at him carefully. "You're not done yet," he smiled gently. "No," he agreed, "but I've done enough." Hope ran toward them at full speed, hair loose in the wind. "Papa," she called, "come see the creek." He laughed softly. "I'll watch from here," she pouted playfully. "Don't be old," he grinned. "I'll try not to." Clara felt tears threaten unexpectedly. Samuel noticed. "You're crying again," he teased softly. "I cry when I'm grateful," she answered. He grew quiet for a moment. "So do I," he admitted. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long across the prairie. Samuel leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. "I used to think redemption meant erasing the past," he said softly. "And now I know it means building something better because of it." Clara rested her head against his shoulder. The air was warm, the wind gentle, the house behind them full. "Samuel," she whispered. "Yes, if I had to live it all again." He turned slightly toward her. "I would still climb into that wagon," he smiled. "And I would still say 20. Silence followed, not empty, full. They watched the sky shift from gold to violet. Hope's laughter echoed faintly. Caleb's voice carried steady and strong. Rose's soft humming floated from the garden. Clara closed her eyes briefly. The journey from humiliation to dignity had not been straight. It had twisted, burned. Broken, but it had also grown. And as the first stars appeared above them, she felt a peace so deep it settled into her bones. The auction had been the spark, the standing had been the choice, the love had been the foundation. And the life built afterward, that had been the miracle. Samuel squeezed her hand gently. "You hear that?" he murmured. "What? Our legacy?" She listened. Laughter, work, wine through wheat, children unafraid. "Yes," she whispered. "I hear it." And as twilight embraced the prairie once more, Clara understood that the story did not need another dramatic chapter. It did not need more trials. more fires, more battles, because the truest victory had already been won. They had chosen each other, they had chosen courage, and they had never stopped standing, and that was enough. The day came quietly, no storm, no warning, just a soft morning light spilling across the prairie. Clara woke before dawn as she often did and reached across the bed. Samuel's hand was warm, still, too still, her heart began to pound. Samuel, she whispered, no response. She pushed herself up on one elbow, studying his face. Peaceful, not strained, not frightened, peaceful, tears filled her eyes instantly. Samuel, she said again, this time with trembling breath. His chest did not rise. For a long moment she simply stared. The world did not shatter, it hushed. A long, deep hush that wrapped around her like snow. She pressed her forehead gently against his shoulder. You kept your promise, she whispered. He had not left in fear, he had not left in anger, he had left in peace. The door creaked open quietly. Hope stepped inside, her hair loose over her shoulders. Mama, she asked softly. Clara turned toward her daughter. Hope saw it instantly. Her hand flew to her mouth. No, Clara nodded slowly, tears sliding down her cheeks. Caleb and Rose came moments later, strong, steady, but breaking inside. Caleb knelt beside the bed, gripping Samuel's hand. You said I was ready, he whispered hoarsely. Rose wept openly, pressing her face into Clara's shoulder. Hope stood frozen, staring. Clara gathered them close. All of you, she whispered, come here. They wrapped around the bed like they had once wrapped around her, a family circle. Built from standing, the news traveled quickly through Briar Hollow. People arrived in quiet waves. Martha, older now but upright as ever, placed a hand over Clara's. He changed this town, she said softly. Clara shook her head gently. We did. The funeral was held beneath the cottonwood tree, the same tree where Hope had taken her first steps, the same tree where Samuel had once sat watching the fields in quiet wonder. The prairie stretched endless behind them. Caleb stood tall, Rose held Hope's hand. Clara stepped forward when it was time to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but only for a moment. He once told me he thought grief was something you carried alone, she began. Soft wind moved through the tall grass. He learned differently. A faint, broken laugh escaped her. He stood when it would have been easier to look away. She looked at the gathered townsfolk. He spoke when silence was safer, her voice steadied. He chose courage. She turned toward her children. And because he chose courage, we built something stronger than fear. Tears flowed freely across the crowd. He was not perfect, she continued softly. He was human, he was grieving, he was stubborn. A faint smile touched her lips. But he chose love anyway, she inhaled deeply. That is what I will remember. The service ended without spectacle, just earth, just sky, just standing. That night Clara sat alone on the porch, the chair beside her empty. The prairie quiet. For the first time in many years, loneliness pressed against her ribs, but it did not crush her, because she knew the difference now between being alone and being abandoned. She was not abandoned, she was surrounded. Hope stepped outside quietly and sat beside her. It hurts, Hope whispered. Yes, Clara said honestly. Will it always? Clara thought carefully. No, she answered gently. But it will always matter. Hope leaned her head against her shoulder. I don't know how to stand without him, she admitted. Clara wrapped an arm around her daughter. You already know how, she said softly. He taught you. Silence stretched long and gentle. The stars appeared overhead one by one. Clara looked out across the fields. The fence stood firm, the barn steady. Caleb's house glowing warmly on the ridge, the land alive. She closed her eyes and remembered the auction. The laughter, the slap, the humiliation, then she remembered the wagon, the fire, the birth, the courtroom, the standing, Samuel's voice saying 20, Samuel's hand steady in hers. Samuel's laugh echoing across the fields, and she realized something that surprised her. Her heart did not feel empty. It felt full, full of years lived fiercely, full of courage passed down. Full of love that did not vanish simply because breath had stopped. She opened her eyes. I would still climb into that wagon, she whispered into the wind. The prairie answered with soft movement through the grass. And though her tears continued to fall, they did not carry despair. They carried gratitude, because the story had never been about how it ended. It had been about how it was lived, and it had been lived standing, always standing. And that would never die. Time did not stop. It never does. The sun still rose the morning after Samuel was laid to rest. The wind still moved through the wheat. Chickens still clucked impatiently for feed. Clara stepped out onto the porch alone for the first time. The empty chair beside her felt heavier than stone, but she did not turn away from it. She sat, and she breathed. Caleb had taken over the early chores without being asked. His footsteps moved steadily across the yard, sure, deliberate, strong. Rose moved through the kitchen, quiet but capable. Hope lingered near the cottonwood, her fingers brushing the bark as though memorizing it. Life did not shatter, it shifted. That evening the family gathered at the table as always, one chair empty, one presence felt in every corner. Caleb cleared his throat before speaking. I was thinking, he began carefully, about the north pasture. Clara looked up. The one that burned, he continued. She nodded slowly. Yes, I want to plant apple trees there. Her breath caught slightly. Apple trees, Rose asked softly. Yes, Caleb said, something that grows slow. Something that lasts, Hope smiled faintly. Something that roots deep, she added. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. Yes, she whispered. Yes, we'll plant them there. The next morning they carried saplings to the very spot where fire had once devoured fence and grass. Clara knelt carefully, pressing her hands into the soil. The earth was warm, alive. She placed the first sapling into the ground. For standing, she whispered. Caleb planted the second. For courage, Rose planted the third. For love, Hope planted the fourth. For hope. They worked in silence for a while, no grand speeches, just hands in soil, roots finding purchase. When they finished, Clara stepped back and looked at the line of young trees. The place that once held smoke now held promise. She felt something shift inside her chest, not grief fading, but grief transforming. That night, as dusk painted the prairie gold, Clara returned to the porch. The empty chair remained beside her, but now it did not feel empty. It felt honored. Hope joined her quietly. Mama, she said softly, does love end? Clara looked out across the fields. No, she answered gently. It changes shape, Hope frowned thoughtfully. Into what? Into memory, into strength, into the way you choose to live. Hope leaned her head against her shoulder. I'm scared I'll forget his voice. Clara smiled faintly. You won't. Because you carry it. She tapped her daughter's chest lightly. Right there, Hope closed her eyes briefly. The wind moved softly through the grass. Crickets began their evening song. After a long silence, Hope spoke again. When you stood on that platform, were you angry? Clara considered. Yes. And afraid? Yes. Then why didn't you bow your head? Clara felt the memory rise sharp, vivid. I almost did, she admitted softly. But then I remembered something. What? That I was still me, Hope nodded slowly. And now, Clara looked at the apple saplings silhouetted against the fading light. Now I remember that we are still us. Years passed again. The apple trees grew tall. Children played beneath their branches. Caleb's sons climbed them recklessly. Rose's daughter picked blossoms in spring. Hope married a kind man from the next valley, a man who listened more than he spoke. The ranch flourished. Briar Hollow changed. It became known as the town where people stood up, where silence broke when injustice tried to settle in. And when travelers asked why the north pasture was lined with apple trees, the townsfolk would tell the story. Not as a tale of pity, not as a tale of shame, but as a story of redemption. Clara aged gently, her steps slower, her hair silver, but her eyes remained steady. One evening, many years later, she sat once more on the porch beneath a sky blazing with sunset. The apple trees rustled softly in the wind. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the yard. She closed her eyes, and she saw it all again. The platform, the laughter, the voice saying 20, the wagon wheels turning, the fire, the birth, the courtroom. The standing, the love, the loss, the legacy. A soft smile touched her lips. I would still climb into that wagon, she whispered. The wind carried the words across the prairie, and somewhere in the rustling leaves of the apple trees it almost sounded like laughter in return. Not cruel, not mocking, warm, free, and Clara understood something fully at last. Redemption was never about erasing what happened. It was about what you built afterward, and what she built, what they built, would outlive them all. Because it had been planted in courage, watered with love, and rooted in standing, always standing. The apple trees bore fruit for the first time the year Clara turned 70, small at first, tart, stubborn, but alive. She held the first apple in her hand as though it were something sacred. The skin glowed red beneath the late summer sun. Caleb stood beside her, smiling softly. Hope hovered close, eyes shining. From fire to fruit, Hope whispered. Clara nodded, yes. She took a careful bite, sweetness flooded her tongue. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was back on that platform, the crowd jeering, the humiliation burning, and then she was back here again, holding something grown from that very soil. She laughed quietly, ha ha ha, not bitter, not broken, free. The ranch had changed over the years. Caleb's children ran where he once had. Rose's daughter learned to ride near the creek. Hope's little boy toddled toward the barn without fear. No one here had ever known the auction firsthand, but they knew the story not as shame, as foundation. One evening, as the sky deepened into amber, Clara gathered the grandchildren beneath the cottonwood tree. Tell it again, Grandma, one of them begged. She smiled gently. I suppose you're old enough now. They leaned in. She told them about the poorhouse floor, about holding her children tight, about the slap. A few of the younger ones gasped in outrage. She smiled softly. Yes, it hurt. She told them about the silence before the bid, about the way the crowd shifted when a quiet voice said 20. About stepping into the wagon without knowing what waited. Were you brave? One child asked. She shook her head slowly. I was afraid. Then why did you go? Because staying would have meant losing myself. They grew quiet. She told them about the fire in the north pasture, about the courtroom, about the women who rode through the storm, about the baby born too soon, about the debt paid by a town that chose to stand. She did not skip the grief. She did not soften the loss. She told them about the morning Samuel didn't wake. Tears shimmered in small eyes. But he didn't leave us empty, she said softly. What did he leave? Another child asked. She touched her chest. This, she gestured toward the fields. That, she pointed toward the apple trees. And this. She took their small hands in hers. The wind moved gently through the branches above. One of the older grandchildren asked quietly, do you ever wish it hadn't happened? Clara considered. The platform, the humiliation, the fear. Then she looked at the faces around her, at the orchard behind them. At the house glowing warm in the distance. No, she said finally, I wish it hadn't been cruel, but I do not wish it hadn't been. They didn't fully understand yet, but one day they would. That night Clara walked alone to the north pasture. The apple trees stood tall now, branches heavy with fruit. She placed her palm against one trunk. From ashes, she whispered. The wind answered softly. She looked up at the stars. $20, she murmured with a faint smile. The number once meant humiliation. Now it meant beginning. She felt age in her bones, but not regret, never regret. She closed her eyes. I kept standing, she whispered into the dark. And she felt, not in sound but in memory, a familiar warmth, as though a hand still rested steady in hers. The prairie hummed quietly, the house behind her held laughter, the orchard rustled with life. And Clara understood that stories do not end when people leave. They continue in roots, in habits, in courage passed down without even noticing. She turned back toward the house slowly, her steps careful but unafraid. The night was peaceful, the wind gentle, the land steady. And though time would soon carry her into the next chapter, the one no one avoids, she felt no fear. Because her life had not been defined by what was done to her. It had been defined by what she built afterward, and that was more than enough. The final autumn came quietly. The apple trees stood strong now, no longer saplings, no longer fragile, their branches heavy with fruit that glowed red against the golden fields. Clara moved slowly through the orchard, one hand brushing the bark as she walked. The air carried the scent of ripe apples and dry grass. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the house, though she no longer chased after it. She simply listened. Hope walked beside her. You shouldn't be out long, Hope said gently. The air's cooler today, Clara smiled faintly. I've stood in colder winds. Hope laughed softly through tears she tried to hide. They stopped beneath the very first tree they had planted. For standing, Hope whispered, remembering. Clara nodded. She lowered herself carefully onto the small bench Caleb had built years ago beneath its branches. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in warm gold. Do you remember the silence? Clara asked softly. What silence? Hope replied, right before he spoke. Hope smiled gently. $20. Clara closed her eyes. I thought my life had ended, she murmured, but it was only turning. Hope took her hand. You turned it. No, Clara whispered, we did. The wind moved through the orchard, leaves rustling like quiet applause. Clara opened her eyes and looked toward the house. Caleb stood tall near the barn. Rose carried baskets inside. Grandchildren darted between the trees. Life, strong, unafraid. Promise me something, Clara said softly. Anything, Hope answered immediately. When the world laughs at someone you stand, Hope's fingers tightened around hers. I will, and when fear tells you to bow your head, I won't, Clara smiled. That's my girl. The sun slipped lower. Shadows stretched long across the fields. Clara felt her breathing slow, not strained, not frightened, simply tired. She leaned back against the tree trunk. I would still climb into that wagon, she whispered one final time. Hope's tears fell freely now. And he would still say 20, she replied. Clara's lips curved gently. Yes, the wind moved softly across the prairie. Leaves drifted down around them like quiet blessings. Hope squeezed her hand. Stay with me, she whispered. Clara's eyes remained on the horizon. I am, she breathed. And in that golden light, beneath the tree planted in ashes, Clara Whitmore Reed closed her eyes. Peacefully, without fear, the orchard stood. The house glowed warm, the land stretched endless and alive. And though her breathing stilled, her story did not. Because later that evening, as the family gathered beneath the cottonwood tree, Caleb spoke. We are not defined by what was done to her, he said firmly. We are defined by what she built. Rose nodded through tears. By what they built. Hope stepped forward, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. They stood, the children listened quietly, and the story was told again, not as tragedy, not as pity, but as legacy. Of a woman who refused to bow, of a man who chose courage over silence, of a town that learned to stand together. Of land once scorched that grew orchards, and of $20 that changed everything. The wind carried their voices across the prairie, the apple trees rustled softly, and somewhere in that gentle sound, if you listened closely, you could almost hear laughter. Not cruel, not mocking, warm, free redemption.